Welcome to Forest FM. Today we have the first part of a conversation between State Forester Matt McCombs and Dr. Tony Cheng.
Tony's interim department head of the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at the Warner College of Colorado State University. He is also a professor in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship and is the former director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University. And he's also been a huge mentor of mine.
Tony's a champion of the collaborative management model, an approach that's key to working with stakeholder groups here in Colorado. The conversation you'll hear today reflects on the past and the future of Colorado's forests through the lens of two industry professionals with a wealth of experience. And though these two have worked alongside each other and shared ideas for many years, they're taking the opportunity here to dissect some complicated topics when it comes to why and how we manage forests in Colorado.
Thanks for being here, Tony.
Thanks a lot for having me. Yeah, I've been at Colorado State for now 25 years. I started in January of 2000. Prior to that, I finished my PhD at Oregon State University in forestry with an emphasis on forest social science, kind of human dimensions, policy dimensions. And then I've a master's degree in forestry at University of Minnesota and an undergraduate degree in political science from Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. I'm a native of Eastern Washington, so kind of a native Westerner. My research interests, as you mentioned, are very much about the people side of forests, how we manage them, how we use them, who gets to decide how those decisions get made. I took an interest in that research track from my political science days, because politics is all about those questions, right? Who gets a seat at the table? What kind of power do they have? Who gave them that power? How is that power used? And what values get emphasized and prioritized when you get to make decisions about anything? For me, the forest side comes from just growing up in Eastern Washington and spending a lot of time, especially in scouting. Being in the Scouts afforded me opportunities to go camping, hiking, fishing, all those kinds of things in northern Idaho, northeastern Oregon, the Cascades of Washington. So for me, when I started having some initial existential crises at the age of 21, when I graduated from college with a political science degree, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. But all I knew that I really enjoyed was that time spent in outdoors, and I really didn't even know there was a profession of forestry or natural resources. And at the time, my parents had moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where my pop became a department head for the Soils and Water and Climate Department at university there. And I was living in their basement as aspiring 21-year-olds freshly graduated from college do. And that existential crisis really kind of brought me back around to what I really wanted. And fortunately, at the University of Minnesota, had a long-standing excellent forestry and natural resource program. And so that combination of the political science, the interest in kind of questions of politics, kind of little p politics, I would say, right? Not, political parties or this and that, but just politics as the struggle of how society orders its priorities and values. To me, that's politics. And then who gets power to advance those values and priorities. At the time, a lot of things, as I was getting into forestry, so I ended up taking, forest ecology and dendrology and all the kind of biophysical stuff. There was a issue brewing, especially out west here, around an owl and forests, and it was the northern spotted owl issue, which is an obligate species of what they call now old growth mature forests. And those forests were rapidly declining as a result of timber harvesting. And so it was just this classic story of values and priorities and power and who gets to make decisions. But the other part that also brought me into this was growing up in a fairly small rural community in Eastern Washington and being in Scouts and working in Scout camp and having all of my friends, a lot of my friends, being from families who worked in the forest industry or agriculture or any kind of land-based livelihoods. Those communities and those people didn't have a voice in the power play. Right? They didn't have attorneys and lobbyists and those kinds of things, and they were getting caught in the middle. And when I graduated from my master's degree, I got recruited through a Society of American Foresters convention by a guy named Al Sample, who you might have known. He was the president for the Pinchot Institute for Conservation at one time. But Al showed up at the SAF meeting that I presented my master's thesis at and recruited me to work for him. He was working at American Forests at the time, at the Forest Policy Center. And there, one of his projects was to find the middle ground in between the either-or debates of values and priorities. We were starting to see people working together, collaborating around mutual interests and mutual issues. They didn't agree on everything, but they agreed on enough of we want to keep forest. We all love wildlife and clean water, and we all want those same things. It may be how we get there. And so those were the early days of a lot of these forest collaboratives back in like 1992, 93 out west here. And that is what really excited me, were these kind of outside of government processes, outside of agency bureaucracies, courtrooms, legislative arenas. There were people who were self-organizing to just solve problems for themselves, their communities, their families, their economies.
I was exposed to the things that you've been working on since the 90s. Early in my life, as you know, my background was for natural resources was in politics, and it for a lot of folks at the point in time of my career, they thought that I would naturally go into politics, the big P politics, the partisanship, rooted politics. And what I discovered is that what motivated me more than anything was good governance, was an expression, the government being an expression of the people's will, bound by certain sort of rules and mores that would theoretically yield the results. And nowhere that was I able to find where you could influence the things most important to the American people, clean air, clean water, clean soil, abundant opportunities for recreation and habitat for our wild neighbors, without having to stand for election, was the district ranger of the U.S. Forest Service. So it's interesting because I think we were drawn to both the people, but also, more importantly, how the people interact with the natural resources and express their values and priorities through engagement with the governance of those, precious components of our natural heritage. So I'm glad that we sort of drifted right into the collaborative management concepts. There's this model that has been a feature of your study and research, as well as that of your students and the folks that you've been sort of bringing along into the discussion, into the debate. So let me start with a big question. Within the context of climate change, right? I often talk about the scale and intensity of the problem that we're facing down. Are the tools and approaches that we're utilizing equal to that intensity? And so from your perspective, being one of the prime chroniclers of the movement, is the collaborative management model working in the era of climate change and megafire?
Well, first, I think we have to define what success looks like, what progress looks like. How do we know where we can look back after 5 years and say, yeah, there was an increment of change that occurred, and we have to be really clear-eyed about what that change looks like. A lot of times we don't really know that until we've kind of gone through that. Here's an example of this, Matt. One of the long-standing kind of experiments in collaborative governance is the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And for your listeners, just the shorthand is this is a competitive funding allocation program through the U.S. Forest Service, and that competition is for funds to go to collaboratively developed forest restoration and wildfire mitigation kind of strategies. And there's a bunch of other components, but this program was established through an act of Congress in 2009, and in 2010, the first 10 were selected through an advisory committee, and Colorado got 2 out of the first 10, right, across the whole country, which I think is a testament to, I think, the collaborative background and history and spirit of what we see in Colorado. But so one was here in the Colorado Front Range, and one was in western Colorado, one called the Uncompahgre Plateau. I would say, not to get too granular, but I would say that the learning that we had to do in both those CFLRP projects through it, these are 10-year programs, right? So this is very unique in the federal government, where once you get approved for a program like that, you get the funding for 10 years. And you had members of Congress that were advocating for it. I would say that it was probably at year 9 in 2018 or 19, where we were sitting in a meeting with the Colorado Front Range. And my friend and colleague, Greg Applett, who's with the Wilderness Society, we kind of finally got to the point where we had defined the metrics of what a restored forest might look like, and what kind of fires it might receive, how we went about achieving that through both kind of land management and silviculture, but also kind of collaboratively working with different entities, that we finally knew how to actually do collaborative management after 9 years of the CFLRP. After being granted the funding because we wrote a proposal that says we already know how to do collaborative governance. And we didn't. And so that increment of progress, when I think about the day-to-day, the meeting after meeting, the month-to-month, man, it was gruesome. I mean, we were talking into such granular detail about how many trees are in a group that constitute a restored forest, right? How far apart are those groups? Right. Are they 2 tree lengths or 1 tree length, and it really, I think rightly so, drove a lot of people nuts. But in many ways, and CFRI, we stuck with the process because it was that process that was as important as the product. And even though people in the field might have been frustrated as they were going back to the field after going through this collaborative process and trying out different kinds of things and working with operators who had no idea what we were talking about of kind of this restoration model, all of that learning was important to the progress that we were trying to make. And I think time will tell whether those actual ecological outcomes actually made a difference. But certainly, in a lot of recent fires, that a lot of these treatments that were tested by fires, we know that the fires burn with much lower severity. Firefighters found safe havens in those areas, especially around like Red Feather Lakes area. They were able to do safe backburns that steered the fire away from the community. So I think we are accumulating some anecdotal evidence, but that's also part of that progress. And so I want to come back to that moment when Greg said, it's only after 8 or 9 years when we finally knew how to collaborate, is because we knew what questions we had to ask. We knew how to frame what success or what progress looks like. And in our era of soundbite politics, and we want things done immediately and quickly, I want to get back to your question, answering the question of, is it up to the task of climate change? I think it's only through that working through that process to unwind kind of how we have thought about the simplicity of solutions, that we dig into that complexity that is climate change. It's not for everybody, but my question is, what's the alternative?
What's the alternative? No. So that is where I'm most interested, is that, I have a deep sense of urgency in this role at this time, especially in a post-2020 environment, and acknowledging that conditions are only degrading and are doing so more rapidly. But it's really, do we have 9 years? Each time we come to table to try to share and establish values, to identify priorities on a map, and then to foment the regulatory processes that unlock action. And so, you and I were in a conversation and on this theme, and that was when I blurted out, I want to move from collaboration to collaboration. The key here is how do we help incentivize real-time decision-making in relation to the breakthroughs that we make in the value sharing and prioritization processes that are natural to and inherent in the collaborative governance model? How do we transfer that goodwill and that understanding and that deconfliction and the reduction of the complexity into broad-scale manipulation of landscapes that people are still very skeptical of our ability to do anything right in? Even to this day, even with the challenges that the state has faced, there's still a deep-rooted cynicism about what the objectives are inherent to forestry, and which I take huge umbrage with. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that and embrace it and engage it. So how do we move into an action-biased collaborative governance model?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question. That's a fair question. And so I'm going to bumble through it because I think one of the challenges that I think all of us that work, especially in states that have a preponderance of federal land, is that there are institutional factors that affect the ability of translating those collaborative agreements into action when you're talking about a federal land agency or any federal government agency. So maybe we can kind of set that aside because I'm sure we'll get to that. I think we make the most progress with state and non-federal lands. First, because they're less burdened by a whole variety of things, and I'm not just talking about the National Environmental Policy Act and those kinds of things. It's just the layers of procedure and approvals and signing off that are endemic to a lot of federal agencies. It's not law; it's their own regulatory approaches. They regulate themselves. It's just sort of less. As you get to lower and lower levels of government, the closer to the ground you get. And I have seen a lot of changes in your agency, in the Colorado State Forest Service, in terms of going bigger, right? Kind of not just sort of landowner by landowner, stewardship services, which is still important, but really thinking more broadly, watersheds, larger community scale. So building out at larger scales, first of all, looking at the planning, analyzing and planning at the scale that's commensurate to the disturbance. Right? That's always been a very profound theme for me, a very simple heuristic. That if you're just planning, 100 acres or even 500 acres, you're not meeting the moment. Developing strategies and plans, even if you might not have the funding for it, even if you might not have even the social consent and all the landowners and your neighbors or even your own people aligned, you're at least putting that out there. Because if you don't have that out there as a goal and a strategy and a vision, then people aren't even imagining that. And so doing that work and building maps and saying, this is what we're talking about. This is the kind of work that needs to happen. And I think even 10, 15 years ago, if you tried to do that, I think it would just be so abstract and bend people's minds. But especially after 2020, Matt, especially locally where you had the Cameron Peak Fire and the East Troublesome Fire. These are 200,000 acre fires, runs that were 60 to 100,000 acres in like less than 24 hours.
Overnight.
Jumping the Continental Divide. So now people are like, well, maybe even 50,000 acres isn't even big enough anymore. Right. So in some ways, the climate fire crisis has now opened the opportunities for us to have to do this, have to think much bigger, and that just sort of these smaller scale approaches that we have been used to doing just don't cut it anymore. This is kind of how I think about policy to my undergraduate class. There are ideas, there are individuals, there are institutions, and there are impacts. It always starts with ideas and individuals that carry those ideas. And a lot of times, if they're new or they bend people's minds too much, they run up against institutional barriers. But as more and more individuals start circulating around those ideas, which is what collaborative governance does, you start being able to create leverage against those institutions to show the ways we're doing things today are insufficient. And you just have to have enough caring critical mass, right, to be able to break that leverage open. And I think I see it happening, at least local, in terms of state, local, through these forest collaboratives and those kinds of things. The thing that maybe is lagging is capacity, right? Money, people, technologies. But again, we can't let that always hold us back. If we have plans and strategies and ideas and individuals that are continuing to promote it, eventually those institutions will catch up to it. I think we've seen it. I think we're seeing it. I think we have to also come to what do we consider as success or progress when it comes to the fire crisis and especially forestry. I think there's now a growing body of evidence of data that show that when you do forest treatments, and especially if those treatments are followed up by fire, at a large enough scale, we are affecting the severity and progression of fire. I think that's good. I think we need to celebrate that. I think we can also do with or without. If we hadn't done a lot of those treatments, what would have happened with some of these fires? The fact that we are seeing a lot of tree reproduction in the middle of fairly high severity burns because we've done treatments in the past shows that those were successful. We as a profession don't do a great job telling that story because right now the story is dominated by a binary fire or no fire, good or bad. If there is a fire, then it must be bad. That for me, that's hard because anytime you see smoke like the Alexander Mountain fire, the vast majority of it was fairly low severity, but many homes were burned. Is that a forest management problem?
Right. Is that a good fire or a bad fire?
Yes. It's not a good fire because people lost their homes and people were displaced and those kinds of things. It could have been a far worse fire if there wasn't the forest treatments. I think those narratives, you and me, Matt, and a lot of people we hang out with, we tend to talk in an echo chamber.
To each other, as we're doing now.
And we agree with each other for the most part. We generally agree on ends. Maybe we might differ in means. We might differ in terms of semantics and those kinds of things. When I think about desired conditions, one of my desired conditions would be for a county commissioner to come out during and after fire to say, this was a good fire. And we're going to help people rebuild and get back and make them whole, but this was a good fire. How do we achieve that desired condition?
Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next part of this conversation where Matt and Tony will keep talking through some big picture ideas when it comes to the future of Colorado's forests.